Hello everyone, my name is Isam Saba and today I'm going to present you a video about the African American as a population of the United States, their history, experience and civil rights movements. So, the African Americans' history started in the 16th century with people from West Africa forcibly taken as slaves to Spanish American, and in 17th century with West African slaves taken to English colonies in the north of America after the founding of the US. Africans continued to be enslaved and the last 4 million black slaves were liberated after the Civil War in 1865. In the past, African Americans have been known by many names throughout American history, including colored and negro, which are no longer accepted in English. Nowadays, 55% live in the South. 88% of them live in cities like New York, California, Chicago, and Florida. However, New York City and Chicago are cities with largest black population. More than 2 million live in New York and more than 1 million live in Chicago. African Americans were taken from their homeland and brought to America as slaves. Slaves were stripped from their native lands but held on their individual cultures, languages, and customs. So, the slaves developed other means to communicate and celebrate their culture. One such way was to tell stories and sing in songs. Whereas a large majority of white population discriminated against African American. Most did not want to give them any rights, but there were some who believed they should get legal rights but no political rights. African Americans were discriminated against through verbal and physical violence. The discrimination on streets, railroads, parks, libraries, and other public places. Then African Americans lived in deep fear. They were subject to verbal discrimination and brutal attacks on the street. Anything they did could put them in danger. The process of assimilated in the United States has been much more successful for white ethnic groups than for non-white ethnic groups. On the non-white ethnic groups, Americans of African descent have had the greatest difficulty in becoming assimilated into the larger culture. They were brought to the US against their will to be sold as slaves. And they went to America thinking that they will make their living conditions better. The enslavement of African Americans divided the US into two different sectors. The first one is the southern states, in which black slavery became the basis of the economy. Then the northern states, which chose to make slavery against law. Abraham Lincoln appealed to both the white idealists who saw slavery as injustice to African Americans and to the larger numbers of northern whites who saw slavery as a threat to themselves. Lincoln's argument was that if black slavery continued to spread westward, white freedom and equality would be threatened. The southern states left the Union after Lincoln won the presidency in 1860. Then they tried to form their new nation of their own based on slavery. The black slavery ended in the USA after the victory of the North in the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, and that was the bloodiest and most destructive of all the nation's war. Moving to the civil rights movements, which is a term that encompasses the strategies, groups, and social movements in the USA whose goals were to end racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans and to secure legal recognition and federal protection of the citizenship rights enumerated in the Constitution and federal law. It was led by Martin Luther King, who won the 1964 Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the movement. In his famous speech, Martin Luther King said, "These two races are fastened to each other without intermingling, and they are unable to separate entirely or to combine. Although the law may abolish slavery, God alone can obliterate the traces of its existence." African Americans were not readily assimilated into the larger American culture despite of abolishing the slavery in 1860. Most of African Americans remained in the South where they were not allowed to vote, then they were segregated from whites. The 1960s civil rights movements both lobbied and worked with Congress to achieve the passage of several significant pieces of federal legislation overturning discrimination practices. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 expressly banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin in employment practices and the unequal application of vote registration requirements, and prohibited racial segregation in schools, at the workplace, and in public accommodations. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 restored and protected voting rights for minorities by authorizing federal oversight of registration and elections in areas with a historic underrepresentation of minorities as voters. The Fair Housing of 1968 banned discrimination in the sale or rental of housing. Then from 1964 to 1970, a wave of inner-city riots in black communities undercut support from the white community. The emergence of the Black Power movement, which lasted from about 1966 to 1975, challenged the established black leadership for its cooperative attitude and its practice of nonviolence, instead demanding political and economic self-sufficiency to be built in the black community. That's all for this video. Please leave a like and a subscribe to get other videos and support our work. Goodbye.